Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm John Zipperer, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and Michelle's co-host for this program. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Commonwealth Club of California is a 118-year-old, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to the civil discussion of important issues of the day. Any opinions expressed here are those of the speakers. The Commonwealth Club produces about 500 programs a year, even during the pandemic. So you can head over to commonwealthclub.org or even specifically commonwealthclub.org/MMS for additional lists of upcoming programs, as well as podcasts and video from past events. If you're watching us live on YouTube, use the chat box to submit questions for our special guest today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Meow, the producer and host of the Michelle Meow Show, and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. Good to see you again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all of you for joining us for this great program. Our guest today is Dr. Laura T. Murphy, who is a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at the Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. She's the author of The New Slave Narrative, The Battle Over Representations of Contemporary Slavery, Survivors of Slavery, Modern-Day Slave Narratives and Metaphor, The Slave Trade in Western African Literature, and now her latest book, Freedomville, a 21st Century Slave Revolt in India, in which we will discuss today. Dr. Laura Murphy, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, why don't we begin with, your own interest in just the subject, and also I think I'm saying it wrong, but Azad Nagar or Freedomville.
Azad Nagar.
Azad Nagar. Thank you.
Yeah. So in general, my interest in contemporary forms of slavery started when I was in graduate school doing my PhD on the transatlantic slave trade. And I came across information which included a video about the people of Freedomville that we'll talk about today, that made me realize that what I was studying, people who had been forced to work against their will, typically without pay, almost always under threat of violence, that those characteristics of slavery were in effect in contemporary capitalist society as well, and all over the globe. That what I was studying in the past was not just a thing of the past, but that it was a thing of the present. And so I pretty radically changed the trajectory of my work. I'm from the South, Southern Louisiana, and I felt a real commitment to recognizing not only historical slavery and the legacies of historical slavery, but also to work really actively to address any forms of slavery or forced labor that might be in existence today. So I shifted my work to the contemporary period. And since then, I've been working to understand the mechanisms by which capitalist society maintains systems of slavery all over the world. And the people of Azad Nagar, or Freedomville, as we translate it for the book, were a group of people who had been, who had a documentary made about them in 2004, because they had this revolt, the successful revolt. And I learned about them in the very earliest days of my learning about contemporary slavery, and their experiences became sort of an animating force for me in thinking that we can do something, that people do have the agency to fight back against contemporary forms of slavery. And so I became very interested in their story, and that's sort of the very beginning of my interest in their lives and their experiences.
Well, in this hour here together, we're going to get into a lot about Freedomville and the story of what happened there and what is happening there. But I kind of want to do the big picture first, because as you mentioned, finding out just what is going on around the world, how many people are still in conditions of slavery. So set this out for us. How many people are we talking about? Where is this found? What types of slavery is this? Is it the kind of slavery people would look at and say, that reminds me of what I learned about the American South? Or would they, are they thinking in terms of Roman Greek? I mean, what is actually going on around the world?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. There are a number of different bodies that create estimates for the number of people who are enslaved around the world. One estimate suggests that maybe there are 40 million people enslaved around the world right now. This includes a number of different kinds of forced labor. It includes people who are in conditions of chattel slavery, like we knew from the 19th century in the United States. People who are transgenerationally enslaved by dint of their race or ethnicity or position in society. They're born into it and they're forced to work their entire lives and their children's lives, et cetera. There are also experiences like we're going to talk about today where people are bonded laborers. So somebody takes out a debt which bonds them to the person who gave them the loan. But because they're innumerate, they don't understand numbers, they don't understand math, their interest on their loans keep growing. The person who is holding the debt tells them, oh, well, we added a little bit more because you're staying on our land now, or we're adding a little bit more because we gave you extra rice, or we added a little bit more because you needed money for your children's medicine. And so the debt keeps piling up and people never get out of debt. In the case of Freedomville, the people had been transgenerationally indebted to the same family. Their grandparents have been indebted and they were never able to work off the debt. And so we see that as a form of enslavement, that people can never, ever walk away from that experience. At least that's what they think, right? Until something like what we're going to talk about today happens. There are also people who are enslaved in domestic servitude, forced to work in people's houses, people who are forced laborers in the sex trade, people who are forced laborers in any number of industries. I used to say, I'm a teacher and I can't imagine that teaching would be something that you could force someone to do. And then there was a case in my very own state of Louisiana in which Filipino teachers were brought to Louisiana and they were not paid, not given their visas, not allowed to freely move, and not allowed to walk away from their jobs until they found somebody to help them get out. So they're just a wide variety of industries in which someone can be forced to do the work or not be paid and be held held in captivity without the ability to walk away. And that's what we're talking about. It's really about people who can't walk away from a job. It's not just a bad job. It's not a low paid job. It's about jobs where people believe that they cannot walk away.
And you set this up kind of talking about various forms of capitalism around the world using this. Would you also throw in something like North Korea, a system where kind of the whole country kind of seems to be in an enslaved situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think North Korea is a good example of like an extraordinary system of people who are enslaved. Not everyone, of course, in the country, but also, I look at it in a place like China, but, a lot of this is undergirded by the capitalist system. People are producing in North Korea and in China, in Western China, in Xinjiang province, for instance, they're producing goods for export to the rest of the world. And we are complicit in purchasing our T-shirts from fast fashion that we don't paying attention to where it came from. And yet when you buy a shirt for $2, something is wrong here, right? You can't transport a shirt for $2. And so how is it that we're getting these products for so cheap? And this is because our system is not regulating the downward spiral of lack of regulation that goes to the ends of the supply chain, which might end up in North Korea, which might end up in far Western China. And so we kind of ignore the labor that's going on, perhaps in India, because we can't see it and we'd rather not know. And so this is all sort of not every form of enslavement, not every experience of enslavement undergirds the system of capitalism, but a lot of it does. It really is feeding into our supply chains and making some people's lives in the rest of the world quite easy because we don't ask a lot of questions about where our goods come from.
Well, we know in this book, there's a group of people who revolt, and that's in some ways, right, good news. But before we get to that, let's back up and talk about Freedomville and give us some, historical context. And although we're talking about, the contemporary or modern times as far as this revolt goes, the Cole people had been enslaved for generations and generations and generations. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So the Cole people are a group of folks who are called tribal people or Adivasi in India. The Adivasi people are basically indigenous people of India who are practically outside of the caste system. They are some of the poorest people in India. They are not integrated into like social structures, they are largely unemployed. They've been dispossessed of their land, and for centuries, various rulers of India, but also colonial government of the British have dispossessed the Cole people and other Adivasi people of their land and of their rights. And so many of them traditionally were forest dwellers. They lived on the wood and the berries and the foods and the fruits of the forest. But through successive generations, they've been pushed off their land as people turned it into farmland or, made money from whatever it was that the Cole people or the Adivasi people were making their livelihoods off of. And so generation after generation has seen Cole people fight back, push back, saying, no, we won't stand for this. But generation after generation, the government is more powerful. They're able to bring out people who can put down whatever resistance the Adivasi people might have. And over time, it came to be that many Cole people became enslaved to the rich and the powerful of the region. They would often take out a debt, like we were talking about before, or lose their land to people who say, well, now you have to work to live on the land that you used to, have for your own. And so they would be forced to work, and successive generations of scholars and religious figures and colonial government researchers and different people have gone and seen this and witnessed it and said explicitly, this is slavery. The people are for like 200 years, people have gone in and said, this is absolutely, a system of slavery whereby people who used to have land and used to have livelihoods here are now indebted or somehow, just required by the rich people in the area to work for them. And so when we get to the late 20th century, early 21st century, this is still a problem, despite the fact that slavery and debt bondage are both illegal in India, as in the rest of the world. There are people like the Cole people, the people I'm going to talk about today, or that I'm talking about in the book, who aren't really in touch with like what's legal and what's not. And nobody's out there telling them what's legal and what's not. And they believe, because their grandparents and their parents had all been indebted and enslaved to the family, the richer families in their area, the landholding families, that they have to work for that family. They don't believe anything other than the fact that they owe these folks their work, their entire lives worth of work. And so by 1998, that's what the people in the book I'm writing about think. They think, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We just have to keep working. We owe it to them. This is our place in life. And there are many people around the world who have that same experience.
And specifically, what was their life like? So take us through kind of like a week of their life. I mean, is everyone working in the mines? How much of the day are they working? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, So the people in Sambarsa, this area is called Sambarsa. So the people in Sambarsa who are Adivasi are working largely in rock quarries. So they go into what is sort of like a vast pit, and they have rock tools and they hammer all day at these rocks. And they start at the age of young children starting to work, hammering or carrying these rocks to trucks to be delivered elsewhere, to be made into roads, into cement and things like that. And they're basically taking stone tools, hammering away at rocks and turning them into gravel. We have machines that do this, but in this region, in like 20 years ago, folks were there in sweating. It's 100 degrees outside. It's really hot there. And there's no shade in these vast quarry fields. And they are just hammering away. And sometimes, some of them would be asked to go and work in the fields, to do agricultural work when the seasonal labor was needed there. Some of them worked in the households of the landholding families who are higher caste than they are. But mostly what they do all day, into the evening is hammer away at these rocks. It is backbreaking work. It is, again, like I said, work that we use machines to do in most of the world and in India now today. And they eat very little. They eat 2 meals a day at most. They're basically eating grain turned into little chapati, breads. They have I've rarely seen people in this area eat a vegetable, much less meat. And they are very much at the mercy of the weather. So if there's a drought, they have even less food. They get paid a little tiny bit by the people for whom they work, but it's not enough really to keep them going. So they're always trying to plant a little something here or there. But the place where they're allowed to live is always the wasteland, is the area that's the rockiest, the desertiest, is that a word? But the most barren, land, the driest land. And so they have very little to eat. They tend to be very thin. They tend to be, they're vulnerable to illness. The rock quarry mining that they do, puts up a lot of silicon into the air, silica in the air. And so silicosis is an issue. Many people die of silicosis from breathing all of the particles that come from the rock mining. It's an extremely difficult life. And they're living in, the people I'm talking about in Freedomville and in Sambarsa are in the poorest region of India. And so they're very, very vulnerable to all these kinds of hardships, forced labor, illness, lack of education for the kids, lack of good land to grow their own food, lack of opportunity. So that was their lives before they decided they had to revolt. Oh, and let me add, and this is not insignificant, they were also subject to all kinds of abuse. The landholding people, whatever their will or whim might be, they had to submit to it. So one person I talked to said, if they came into my house and told me to stand up, that I should never sit in their presence, I had to stand up. If they told me to sit down, I had to sit down. If they told me to go, I had to go. If I told me to come, I had to come. And they talk about they at the time in 1998, when they started to learn about even the possibility of freedom, there was one particular man who was who they call an army man, who was employed during part of the year, but not employed during another part of the year. And when he was in town, everything got worse. He, abused the people physically, sexually, and he was known, around the town as a drunk, and that he was abusive, and everyone was terrified of them. And so there have been several cases of situations where women had been raped or children had been chased after. One young woman resisted his advances, and he set fire to her house. And so they were living, and she died in the fire. And so they were living in the most extraordinary set of circumstances, like really horrific violence was being enacted on them every day. And they felt like they had to take it, like they had no choice.
And what would you say was their life expectancy?
Easily, 40 years old. Like people in that region do not have a very long life expectancy in general. It's lower than, the average life expectancy. But a lot of people, a lot of children died young, but also people died of silicosis. And people also, it's hard for me sometimes to tell how old people are, because these are folks who are out in the sun all day, every day, and who are doing backbreaking work. So I think in general, people aged a lot more quickly. There was always sort of jokes about how people, and their jokes, how I looked younger than they did. it's not funny at all, when it comes down to it, because a lot of them were aged based on the real, or looked aged because of the real dire circumstances they lived in.
Let's talk about resistance, and
Yeah.
because as a human being, I can only ask this question based off of that. And there's so much violence, there's so much oppression. One can only take that until they want to fight back. Let's just plainly put it. And it's not that the Cole people didn't fight back. There were moments of resistance throughout many generations of this type of oppression, right?
Yeah. I think one of the questions that people often ask me when I talk about people who can't walk away from their jobs, they'll also often say, well, why don't they just walk away? Why don't they just leave? Why don't they just fight back? Why don't they pick up a stick and beat the person that they've been working for? And the answer is complex. I think that one of the things that most importantly came out of my conversations with the folks who tried to, like the sort of grassroots organizers in the region who tried to convince the Cole people that they had a right to leave, was the idea that there are people who don't have the idea of freedom, right? That they don't have the idea that they have the right to freedom. And so they have to train them to not fear freedom from the fear of freedom, essentially. And that is not to say that people, when introduced to the idea that they can be free, don't desire it, or even that they don't have the agency for it, but that if after generations, or even if your whole life you've been told you can't walk away from this is your place in life, there's a massive psychological shift that has to be made for you to understand yourself on different terms. And that really came about for a lot of the people in Freedomville when grassroots organizers started coming into town and saying, hey, this is illegal. You can't be, it's illegal for the landholders to force you to do this work. And people like Ron Paul, one of the main people in the story that I talk about, really didn't believe them at first, and also thought, these folks are crazy, and also they're probably dangerous. It's probably dangerous for me to even talk to these folks. And they, when they talk to grassroots organizers, it's true. Landholders came in and said, what are they telling you? Don't believe them. Sometimes even got into physical altercations with the Cole people to try to prevent them from being sensitized to their own inherent freedom. But eventually they start to see that there are other communities around who are taking advantage of this opportunity with the grassroots organizers, people who are just, who live down the road, maybe 30 minutes, who are coming in and saying, hey, look, you can not only be free, you don't have to work for these people. We will help you to secure opportunities for yourself and your children when you leave. Because this is the other thing. Even if you get the idea, even if you have like a sense of your own freedom, you have to also have something to turn to afterwards. These folks have never been outside of a 5-kilometer radius of their houses. They don't have an education. They don't have another job opportunity. Their houses are on the land of the landholder. Where are they going to live? What are they going to eat? How are they going to take care of their children? These are the kinds of questions that keep people working day to day. Don't think that the landholders don't know this, right? And so there's no opportunity for them. And this is as true in India as it is in the United States. A person who's being forced to work in the United States is also thinking, well, what the hell kind of job am I going to have if I walk away from this situation? Where am I going to sleep tonight? If I sleep on the street, it's more dangerous. I might as well stay here. Right? So this is a really complex calculus, freedom is, right? And I think we take it for granted, but people who are enslaved do not take it for granted. And they know that it's not simple. It's not something that you just wake up one day and say, well, let's be free. I'm free. I'm innately free. Let's just do this thing. No, it's really complicated and it's really dangerous. But in Sambarsa, what happened was that these grassroots organizers were kind of going around and doing what I call gossip organizing. They will kind of whisper, notions of freedom in the ears of people who've been working for these landholders for years and years and years, generations. And they say, okay, this is this is illegal. You don't have to live like this. And then they say, well, what will we do if we don't? And then they start helping them to save money, whatever little bits of money they might have. They start helping them to save food away. They start telling them, okay, maybe you can try to, next time there's an election, maybe elect someone from among your people. Because look, there are many more of you than there are of them. So what about electing one of your own? Well, what else can you use? Well, maybe we can help you get a lease to your own quarry. And yep, it's still backbreaking work. It's still horrifically bad, for your health, but you know how to do it, right? And so how about we help you get a lease to your own land, and you basically take back the means of production, and you can sell your own rocks on the marketplace. And if you're sick, you can stay home. And if your kid, you can send your kid to school instead of sending them to the quarry. And so you work for yourself. How about that? And that started to happen. They started to help people get tiny leases, really tiny little leases, save up some money, got donors, international donors to input some money into the system, and got people their own leases. And then people start whispering. So one person goes to another neighborhood and says, my kid is in school. And the other ladies are like, your kid is in school. How did your kid get in school? And so then they're like, wow, we've got this lease. And so people start whispering and they start passing the word. And like on the lower frequencies, everybody's learning about how you get your own lease, how you start saving up a little tiny bit of money that you might get your hands on, how you and how you connect with the grassroots organizers. So they're doing that and whispering amongst themselves and building up one another's confidence and sense of freedom and agency and capacity to be able to have something when they walk away. And that's sort of what was happening in Sambarsa when they decided to have this, basically a revolution.
This might sound weird to ask about this, but it's understanding the psychology, the mentality of the people who are doing this forced labor is one thing. What is the psychology of the landowners? I mean, it's easy to just say, well, they're exploiting the labor, but I mean, to go through those steps of cruelty, to continue this, because they too continue this generation after generation after generation. And what was that? Because there are other ways to run a mine, like you said. They could do mechanization. They could sell the land. They could develop
very
whatever.
little, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
pay the minimum wage, which is
right.
Not even $1 a day.
Right. There are alternatives. So describe kind of what or was this purely a matter of power and kind of caste privilege? I mean, what are we seeing?
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think this is an important part of the book, is that I really felt it was incredibly important for me to also talk to the landholders and to ask them, what were they thinking and what was their response and where were they at on this issue? And, I think this is important because a lot of times when we talk about slavery or we talk about human trafficking or forms of forced labor, I think the go-to is to think of the people who are the slave holding community people as evil. It's real easy to just say they're evil, but generations, whole families of evil, like what does that mean? Like, what does evil even mean? And it is my firm belief that when we just assign oppression to evil, we, in a lot of ways, we just exonerate it. We don't delve into it. We don't think about how it functions. How does oppression actually function? So if we just say it's evil, then we don't have to think real hard about it. And if we don't think real hard about it, we can't stop it. And so, who's stopping evil? Like, right? So in talking to people who were, of the landholding caste in this region, I learned that they too had spent their whole lives being told, believing that the Cole people didn't have freedom, that they didn't deserve freedom, that they weren't made for freedom, that they couldn't survive without them, that they were in fact quite dependent. There was a whole paternalistic narrative about how, and this is familiar to us from 19th century American slavery as well, that in fact, without the upper caste people, the coal people would just starve. They would not be able to survive. And so for generations, they had been told that they were the protectors of the coal and that by keeping them in this system, they were actually helping them. Now, not everybody was doing this for any kind of beneficent cause, right? There was a wide spectrum of people who were in this class of landholders who have people working for them, who run the gamut from people who think that what they're doing is good for people to someone like the army guy who is out there just having his will with anyone he wants. And I met people who ran the gamut of that. And it's an interesting thing to look into the face of what people consider evil, right? And see a person there, a person who's also conditioned by the context in which they were raised. And we'll talk about this later. I didn't get to meet the very worst offender, but I met someone who was his cousin, for instance, who is now the town mayor, essentially, the little area, the village mayor. And he is someone who still has this sense of paternalism that, it's his responsibility in some ways to help these people, the coal people. It's still a condescending position, but it's not the kind of like wild, exploitative vision of the world that you would expect going into talking to someone who has for his entire life had people working for him without paying for them, paying for their work, I mean. And I also talked to somebody else who told me that things just weren't as good. I should mention that because of these rebellions that happened in the late 90s and the early aughts, because of those rebellions, but also because of a series of government incentives programs and entitlement programs, a lot of the kinds of forced labor that were happening in that region aren't happening now. And there are lots of programs to ensure that people get paid the minimum wage, which is meager. I think that this has been bad for everyone, that this is bad for them because they've lost the people who've worked with them, but they've also lost that relationship where they used to loan them money and therefore they would be okay, but now they won't loan them money because they make minimum wage and therefore, they don't have any relationship with them and they can't be sure that they'll pay them back anymore. It's a mythology that this group of people has come to believe about themselves and about their role in the world and about their relationship to the Adivasi people. It's untrue, but that kind of thinking, that paternalistic thinking, still pervades many of the ways people talk about their relationship to the Adivasi people even today, after all of the changes have happened in the last 20 years.
The other side to that question is also understanding, the psychology of a group of people who, stand up for themselves or go through a revolution, and then what happens. I want to read something from, I want to read a little bit from your book here, and it's right when you came back from Freedomville. But after years of learning about the Freedomville revolt, how did I miss the most critical dynamic in securing their freedom? A factor so central to all those other famous slave revolts, the violence. When I returned to the United States after visiting Freedomville, I obsessively rewatched the Free the Slaves video. I reread the interviews I had transcribed myself. There wasn't a single mention of a murder. And so I think it's very important to go back and have you talk about, this little piece that I read, because that incident, we haven't talked about it. Let's go back to that.
Yeah. So the coal people, this group of Adivasis in this one little region became somewhat famous because they, a number of different communities took back the mine and were able to send their kids to school. But this one group of people, in this little town that I went to visit, they had a big rally. They had decided we're going to vote in our own people into the town council office or into the mayor's office, as I was describing before, as a village head. We're going to vote our own guy in, and we're going to get a lease to our own mine, rock quarry, and we're going to win the day. We're going to be free. And they did. They successfully did that. There was an altercation, and they, some people ended up in jail, and it was complicated. But like the anti-slavery establishment essentially took up their story because they really did fight back and get their own lease of their land, send their kids to school. There was a documentary made about this little village and how they had won their own freedom. And it was a story about the agency of people who are enslaved and how they themselves, we don't have to have these sort of top-down mechanisms for creating freedom for people, that people go out and fight for their own freedom. And that was an important story. And it's one of the things, like I said, that motivated me to do this work at all. But we always talked about that story as a nonviolent revolution. And in fact, the documentary that was made about them was called The Silent Revolution, and it celebrated the nonviolence aspect of their revolution. It's grounded in Gandhian politics, et cetera. And that was an important story. But I went back to meet these folks in 2014, folks I had been writing about, thinking about, teaching about for a decade. And when I went to meet them, a whole different story unfolded. I sat down with people in the community and they started telling their story. And the grassroots organizers had really tried hard not to get me to go to Freedomville at all. And I had to cut a section of the book out where they just take me from village to village to village. And I learned about all these other people who were enslaved and who had fought for their freedom, et cetera. And I kept being like, wait, when do we get to the people I'm trying to talk to? When do I get to see Ron Paul? When do I get to see Choti and Sumara and all these folks I've been reading about and hearing about and learning about? And they kept taking me to other villages, days of other villages. I was getting angry, actually. When can I go to see them? And when I finally met them, we sat down and we started talking, and they quickly started talking about the day of the revolt. And this extremely old lady, I mean, just tiny, broken old lady, started talking, and I had a translator, which makes it very difficult to understand what's going on. And it's not the kind of research I typically do. But in this case, I wanted to learn about their story. And so I have a translator translating for me, and she starts talking. She's hacking her hand like this. And I keep asking, what is she saying? What is she saying? What is going on here? And finally, it turns out she's saying, and we beat and we beat and we beat them. And she's making this hand gesture. I keep asking, like, what is she talking about? And it turns out that the people in this area had gone to their big rally. They had talked about having an election and voting in somebody from their own community. They had talked about getting leases to their own land. They had a picnic. Everything was good. And then they were getting ready to walk away to go back home. And the really mean army man, his name is Virendra Pal. Virendra comes up and starts to mess with the women as they were walking back and starting to like punch at them. And some people say a gunshot was shot off, and like people start to fight. Now, what I learned when I went back, I'd always known that there was an altercation. There's always there was a bit of a fight, a struggle, and there was often like sort of a passive voice. And in the melee, someone was killed or someone had died. And the way people had understood it was that, there were some rocks thrown and maybe somebody got hit and there was an accident kind of thing. No. These folks tell me when I get there, after 15 years of telling their story, that they had brought their hammers, their rock crushing hammers and poles and sticks to the meeting because they knew that this guy was going to come and try to start a fight. And they intended to end the fight today. That their plan was that they were going to kill these people and they were done with it. And it was always plural. Like, we did this and we did that. And I'm looking at this old lady and I'm thinking, surely she didn't kill anybody. And surely they're talking about dreaming of killing someone. Oh, no, right? No, these folks went to this event carrying their stone tools with the expectation that there would be a fight and that they were going to win this time. And they far outnumber, like I said, the landholders. And so it was a very different story I was hearing. And they were saying, oh, no, we murdered him. We totally killed that guy. We meant to kill him. And we maimed several of his other, buddies. And we were ready to do whatever it took to get our freedom. And like I said, they go to jail. Eight men go to jail for it for several months. The people who are from that village know immediately that there will be a price to be paid. So they run into the woods. One young boy I talked to who's probably about 20 now said that he must be like 25, but he said he was a very young kid, like 5 years old at the time. And he ran into the woods that night because he thought he was going to be killed. And everyone did. Everyone thought they're coming for us. They're going to come with guns and we will all be killed. And they knew this was coming because they intended to go and win the fight this time. But it was still a very terrifying time for them because, again, where were they going to run? What were they going to go to? So they all spread out and went to different families' houses where they all had very little for quite a long time until grassroots organizers helped them get out of jail. I don't know where to start. Let's stop and start. I mean, it's such an interesting story. But about the violence, I mean, the thing that's important is that here was a situation where we had understood this to be a nonviolent revolution, when in fact it had been a plotted violent revolution. And we had all missed that. We had all been thinking completely wrongly about what happened there.
And how does that kind of play into popularly known and kind of even stuff that's lauded as being nonviolent when it really couldn't have come? In other words, not just this incident, but kind of that's the ideal is Rosa Parks quietly coming home from work and riding the bus.
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't violent, but that was planned. Because
we also know Rosa Parks was much cooler than that too.
Right. But I mean, talk a bit about that whole kind of fetishization of the nonviolent for situations that where that fetishization only helps the people who are perpetuating the violence or the oppression.
Right. And this is one of the big takeaways from this, from talking to the people in Ajadnagar. They end up naming their town two things. One, Hullable, which is the word for strike and to raise our voices there. So the thing that they did was have a strike. They had a number of strikes, which they called Hullable, and they named their town Hullable to commemorate that strike. But they also named their village Ajadnagar, which means Freedomville. And so these two things are a commemoration of their fighting back, and that are a constant needling of the people in the area to remind them of that moment of violence. And yet everyone sort of erased it for the public picture. And, there are a lot of good reasons. We can talk about why they may have done that, why people in the US, the nonprofit groups might have done that. But, the thing that we realize when we start to think about violent revolution is how often we say things. I constantly hear pundits and politicians and intellectuals say, well, there's no excuse for violence. You can just type in Google. I did it the other day. Type in no excuse for violence. There're just tons and tons and tons of politicians who are out there like, I really understand the concerns of, the Black Lives Matter movement, but there's no excuse for violence. And I think what this is like really pointedly showing us is that there is every excuse for violence. There's every reason why people who for generations have been the victims of violence do at some point break and say, look, that's it. Because they've tried all of your official channels. They've gone to government officials. They've tried to get their entitlements. They've tried to have their own life. They've tried to be free without a revolution. They've tried to submit police reports. They've tried to complain about the violence. They've tried to, get other jobs. They've tried all these. They've tried sending their kids to school. They've tried all these different things that are the official channels that we all say this is the way. Or they've tried sitting quietly or having a strike or just taking a day off of work to show you what it's like, when the workers don't come out. But what is that met with? It is continuously met with more violence. And so here are people, and this is about violent revolution all over the world. We want to say, oh, well, they shouldn't burn down this, or they shouldn't loot that, or they shouldn't steal this, or they shouldn't fight back in this way. They should use the channels of power that are available to them. They're not available, right? They're simply not available. And they meet that day after day, trying to resist in the official ways that people want them to. And so, in the case of the people of Ajadnagar who took back their freedom, they tried getting a lease without it. They tried saying, please don't beat our children. They tried filing police reports that never got to see light of day. They tried all those things, and they tried for generations. And this day, at this time, with this man who was extremely violent, they decided enough was enough. And when we say, let's not talk about that violent part. We also don't recognize that violence is sometimes a part of that equation. We essentially act as if violent revolution is irrational when it is probably the most rational response I can imagine, right? It is a clear, tit for tat, but it's also just, they've tried every rational response, and this is yet another one, right? And we also say, well, here are all these, the state has a right to commit violence against them. The landholders end up having a right to commit violence against them all the time. Nobody stops them. The only people who have no right to violence are these most oppressed, most marginalized people. And I think that's, I'm thinking swear words. I think that's garbage. It reinforces oppression. It reinforces the power of people who hold the right to violence, and it's absolutely wrong. And so it also makes it so that we can't respond to the consequences of that violence, because it is the case that many times when there are violent revolutions or violent protests, they are met with even more extraordinary violence. And if you can see that and predict that, you may be able to cut it off. You may be able to put a barrier around it. You may be able to ensure that people get the entitlements that they're fighting for, that they get what they're asking for. Because what happened in Ajadnagar was that in Freedomville was that folks got momentarily the right to a lease. They got the right to send their kids to school. But as soon as international eyes looked away, they had their entitlements taken away. They didn't get everything that everyone around them got because they had been the people who committed this violence. And so the support system that needed to be in place longer for them, because they were the ones who had been accused of the violence and been involved in the violence, it just dried up because no one faced the reality of the aftermath of that violence. And no one really thought, well, okay, we know from human history that often there's a great crackdown on people who respond with violent protest. And so what do we need to do to stop that? Like, we didn't ask the question, what do we need to do to stop that cycle of violence? We're just like, okay, that's how it works, And so ignoring the violence and ignoring what we know about violent protest has left us in a situation where we basically leave people to be vulnerable to the even greater violence that sometimes follows.
Yeah, and for those of us who are not in the position of the oppression that the Cole people experience, we become complicit, we become dependent on these, systems. So much to, to learn and to take away from your book. One question I did have, and I don't know if you want to answer it or if you want to tease that people just get the book and learn, but yeah, what's going on with Freedomville today?
Yeah. So it's been like a sort of a series of return visits where I see their experiences change pretty rapidly. So the first time I went back was in 2014, and they were still fighting to try to get someone in office in the town, the village head's office that was from their community. But the people of Freedomville had really been cut off. They were about to lose the lease. The lease was only like 5 years for their land. Or was it 10 years? It must have been 10 years. So they had a 10-year lease on the rock quarry that was about to not be renewed. They were, they had not gotten electricity, whereas people around them had gotten electricity. There were a lot of things that they weren't getting access to because they were still being held responsible for this, this violence. But then I went back in 2018 and 2019, and some things have really changed, not necessarily for the better, but very different circumstances were happening. So they lost the lease to their land, and a lot of other people had lost the leases to their rock quarries who had fought in that early 2000 period to get their own rights to land. But the landholders had also kind of lost their land, because what had happened was massive corporations had come in and started digging those rocks. And these are some of the wealthiest corporations in India, and they were mining these, what used to be just low pits in the ground. They were mining massive, like 7-story pits. And the work that someone could do over the course of years, like a community could do over the course of years, this company was doing in a couple of months, and digging massive pits in the ground, leaving even the landholding community with land that was completely decimated, that no longer could make them any money. And strangely, there were some actual collaborations, not a lot. It's not a story that's like rah, rah, now everybody gets along. It's not that neat. It's not that, the world doesn't work that way. But there had been a couple of protests in which the landholding people and the coal people had gotten together and marched and protested against the massive corporations. And what we see in the last 20 years in India is definitely a shift away from just all out enslavement and debt bondage, where people simply can't walk away from their work and never get paid, to a system whereby people are free to come and go, but there aren't many options. The minimum wage is still not enough. But, you know, farmers and rock quarry owners, landholders, they've got a different outlook. There is a shift in a younger generation of people who think, of course, we pay people, we just don't pay them much. And maybe we take a little off the top. And, you know, so there's still exploitation of the workers. But now there's this massive move to incorporate Adivasi people into sort of a Hindu nationalism that will allow the current government, the Modi government, to stay in power. And so there have been all these promises to them about getting their land back and getting entitlements and being able to hold office and things like that, that are again being broken. And that, you know, as you know, there've been months of farmers' protests across India. And this is also a result of these promises that have been made to the poorest of the people in India, who are still not seeing any of those promises being kept, and who are still dispossessed. So maybe they're not enslaved, but the massive changes that are going on in India that are supposedly meant to help the poorest of the poor there are in fact leaving them behind again.
When we learn the history of the institution of slavery in the United States, part of that we always learn about is the role of religion, and on both sides, right? On the slave owners, as well as and it being used to enforce the system, as well as people who were inspired by often the same religion to violently, if necessary, oppose slavery. What India is, I don't know if it's the most, but it's one of the most multi-religious countries in the world. What role did religion play in Freedomville and surrounding areas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll be honest and say that I don't have a total grip on how religion plays out. There, you know, I didn't get the sense that that the people in this particular community were particularly religious. They, you know, they have festivals and things like that. They participated in you know, like singing and dancing for things like that. But they didn't identify in any way that was particularly religious, and they also didn't necessarily identify as Hindu. And there's this kind of a strange history, not strange, there is a history of people who are Adivasi or Dalit, who are on the margins of Indian society, being co-opted by Hindu politicians to be a part of their voting bloc. And that was working, that was happening within this area as well, like people trying to win their votes over. So religion, what we consider religion as a political strategy, that was in effect there. But I don't know, so I mean, I would kind of put it that way. I think that a lot of times we think of religion in the US as a practice and not an identity. And I think there's a lot more of that identity driven thinking about Hinduism and Islam in India.
I kept thinking as I was reading this book that there's so much to learn from it, and there's so much to take away, and there's so much that I can apply, even here in the United States, and especially speaking up for many marginalized communities who are continually oppressed. And so the question goes back to you. What do you think is the biggest thing that we can learn, especially if we're truly adequately understanding, the history and what happened to the Cole people in Freedomville? What can we learn from what happened in Freedomville?
Yeah, for me, I think the most important thing is to recognize the rationality of violent protest, and to apply that in our thinking anytime we see protests happening around the world, that we and in the US included, that we don't sort of set aside violent protest as an anomaly or as somehow or a problematic response, but to understand it as a completely rational response to transgenerational violence, and to understand that if we come to terms with the fact of violence, everyday violence for the most marginalized people in our society, if we truly want to address it, we have to address systemic problems that make everyday violence possible, the way we allow certain people to enact violence and completely condemn other people for it, and to really look at the roots, the cultural roots of how we separate people, like the Cole people understanding themselves to be subservient, and people thinking they are subservient, the landholding caste believing they are subservient, dealing with those cultural deeply discriminatory understandings, starting there and reaching all the way to addressing the aftermaths when we aren't able to address the precursors of the violence, to really looking at that violence and saying, okay, we know that what's likely to happen is a violent backlash. How do we stave that off? How do we stop those in power from using this protest against the people? How do we change our own language so that we don't come out and say, I understand how they feel, but they really shouldn't be, responding in this way. All of that, I think we can learn from Freedomville, really addressing it from the precursors of the violence all the way through the aftermath of the violence is critical. And I don't see that happening even as we become ostensibly, a society that is more engaged in rights and racial justice.
I was just going to add everything you had just said. I'm thinking about the people of Afghanistan. Yeah, John?
Before the program, we talked about something that I want to bring into the program, and I think it ties into so much of your approach and what you've talked about today, as well as the book itself. And that is referring to someone who's doing slave labor as a slave or as an enslaved person. And you were very clear about how the terminology you use. So I wonder if you could kind of share with our viewers why you do it that way and why it's important.
Sure. I think that there are two pieces of that. One is the use of the word slavery at all in describing contemporary experiences. There are some people who I very much respect who are very reticent to use slavery to describe anything outside of the American context of the 19th century. And I understand that that logic. I do. I think that a lot of people recognize that the situation in the United States in the 19th century was one of the most horrific articulations of slavery in human history, and the legacy of that slavery still exists today. And I think that a lot of people who work on anti-slavery and anti-trafficking sort of set aside their complicity in race relations today. They kind of set aside historical slavery and don't really want to address that. And in fact, repeat some of the same problematic ways of thinking as, well, not the slaves, but, you know, they have really problematic racial perspectives. And so I get it that people are sort of reticent to think about slavery as a term that we want to apply to anything else. But, you know, slavery has existed for all of human history and in all kinds of contexts. People who've been enslaved have had all kinds of different experiences, including people who were allowed to become like royalty after having been enslaved. So there's a wide variety of things. And I think there's a real importance to using the word slavery with its extraordinary gravity and with real precision when we're talking about people who are forced to work against their will, right? And so I use this word very carefully. And I don't use it metaphorically. You know, I don't say that teacher was a slave driver or some ridiculous thing like that. I think that's super problematic. And I don't use it to talk about people who've had bad jobs. You know, that's not the same thing as what I'm talking about here. But I do think it's important that we use the word precisely so that we know we're looking at something that that has systemic roots, that is rooted in capitalism, is rooted in the history of capitalism, and that is related to legacies of historical and racial violence that we need to address still. But, you know, one of the things that people who study slavery think about is how to talk about slavery without removing the agency entirely of the people who've been enslaved. And so one of the ways we do that is by, you know, saying, you know, an enslaved person or a person who's been enslaved, rather than saying slaves, you know, and you know, still historians of slavery will talk about slaves as a group or, you know, like as an identity, but slavery is not an identity. Slavery is a thing that happens to a person. Slavery is a thing that a person can fight back against. And so I will use enslaved as an adjective, but not as the noun to describe the person. And so, you know, a lot of people are careful about that. There are probably ways that, you know, in 10 years, I'll think the way I'm describing this still hasn't grasped or really grappled with some of the problems of the way we think about slavery in the world, or the way we think about race or the history of slavery. And I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly changing the way I think and the way I understand slavery and agency and life and human identity and these things. So there's probably some way I'm still doing it wrong, and I'm constantly trying to learn. But this is one of the things that I think foundationally we have to shift is thinking about, and that Freedomville teaches us, honestly, is that people who are enslaved have agency, have ways of thinking about their lives, have different perspectives that might not value the freedom that you value or value it in the same way, might have reticence to experience the things you've experienced, you know, and might have different ideas about what constitutes protest and rights and things like that. And so always trying to be open to those new ways of thinking and to really learning from the people with whom I interact in this research.
It's been an incredible hour discussing Freedomville. Thank you so much for this book. Very last question and very quick. So when's the next book out and what's it going to be about?
You know, that's an interesting question. I'd like to know. Any suggestions? I'm interested. No, right now I'm not working on a book per se. I am working on forced labor in Xinjiang, China, in far western China, where you know, upwards of 2 million people are being forced to work to produce the shirts and clothes and electronics and tomato paste that we consume all over the world. And so I'm working on a series of reports that help to, I can't go to Xinjiang anymore. I lived there for a short time, but I can't go there anymore to talk to people because it's extremely dangerous to them and to people who visit. And so, so I've been working with supply chain researchers to better understand how the system of forced labor is working there, to help governments and companies understand how the system of forced labor is working there, and to trace supply chains out of Xinjiang and into our closets. So I recently had a report on the solar energy industry and how forced labor is being used to produce solar panels. I want to say right now I'm pro renewable energy, and I think we all need to use it, but we need to figure out how to do that without it being based on forced labor. So thinking about how to extricate our supply chains from these massive systems of forced labor is what I'm obsessed with right now. And it may or may not turn into a book, but right now that's what I'm doing.
Thank you so much for all your work. If you haven't done so, you should pick up a copy of Freedomville, a 21st Century Slave Revolt in India by Dr. Laura T. Murphy. Laura, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. This was a really great conversation. I'll be happy to talk to you guys anytime. This was fun.
Back to you, John.
Just our thanks again to Dr. Laura Murphy for joining us at the Commonwealth Club. Hope we can see you here in person someday in San Francisco.
Yes.
But until that happens, everyone can find this program and upcoming programs, and of course, video and podcasts of thousands of past programs at commonwealthclub.org. So take care, stay safe. We'll see you in the future.